Participants in a democratic society should be able to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. In a democratic society, policy debates should be determined by the will of the people. The people should be free to think for themselves and come to their own conclusions based on arguments and evidence that they have systematically evaluated, drawing from a free flow of accurate information without being deceived, as well as being free to contribute to the pool of public knowledge themselves. A free press that speaks truth to the powerless is an absolutely vital and necessary precondition for a democratic society. In part 1, I outlined the basic principles behind Thomas Ferguson's investment theory of party competition as a theoretical model, which in essence argues that the existence of capitalism necessitates that the state will be controlled by centres of economic power, rigging the political system so that the public will lose every time. However, direct control over the state by economic elites isn't the only way in which the political system is rigged. Bearing in mind the known facts about class conflict, the inherent antagonism between wages and profits, for the capitalists, it's better that working people don't even attempt to control the state, or take collective action to improve their lives at all in the first place. Not only do economic elites control the state directly, but they must also control and manipulate the public, so that firstly, public participation in the political process is limited to the extent possible, and that secondly, if the public do participate in political action, they must act in such a way that represents the interests of economic elites. This is because the information that they are acting upon comes from a system which disseminates information in order to benefit economic elites, the mass media. What I'm referring to, of course, is Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman's propaganda model. Now, I should point out to begin with that this is not a conspiracy theory. Nobody's suggesting that there's a secret, smoke-filled room full of capitalists who set the agenda for everybody, and anyone who fails to conform with that agenda will be shot. In totalitarian societies, the state typically holds total control over the media in a coercive fashion. But in liberal democracies, the process of manufacturing the consent of the governed takes a far more sophisticated route. Through market forces, the media system is economically structured in such a way that produces systemic biases, causing journalists and reporters to internalize presuppositions about the world, producing ideological conformity, but without the need for any overt coercion. Coercion is not necessary, quite simply because from a very early age, people are socialized into environments in which following the agenda that they're given is simply the easiest thing for them to do, whereas going against the grain is far more strenuous. The propaganda model holds that there are 5 ways in which information is systematically filtered. The first way is ownership. The mass media in most capitalist countries typically tend to be concentrated in the hands of a few very large, profit-seeking private corporations and global media conglomerates such as Viacom, CBS Corporation, Time Warner, News Corporation, Bertelsmann AG, Sony, Comcast, Vivendi, Televisa, the Walt Disney Company, and Hearst Corporation. Now, if we accept the idea that these institutions will not work to undermine their own interests, concentration of media ownership does present a filter for what news will be selected for broadcasting. Journalists working for a very large, profit-seeking private media corporation will be extremely unlikely to broadcast a report criticizing the owners of their own institution. The second filter concerns how the mass media fund their activities. Corporations seek to maximize profit by selling a product to a market, and the mass media are no different. If they want to make a profit, they'll have to sell a product to a market. However, the mass media do not make a profit by simply selling news to audiences. Production costs are too high, and if they wanted to simply sell news at a profit, they would have to charge at a rate that most consumers wouldn't be able to afford. This method usually results in a loss. So the mass media have to make a profit another way. Instead of selling news to audiences, the mass media make a profit by selling another product, audiences, to another market, advertisers. Media corporations make their profits by receiving subsidies from businesses, which are given advertising slots on their channels. Media corporations therefore have to compete with each other for advertisers. For a media corporation to win the approval of advertisers, they must show how their programs necessarily cater to the advertisers' needs. What do the advertisers want? Well, ultimately, they want people to buy their products. So the mass media have to select audiences of a particular sort, those with enough money in their pockets and of a large enough size so that they have the capacity to buy enough products for the advertisers to make a net profit. Not only that, but the mass media must also produce content which causes the relatively privileged audience to use its capacities and buy the products being advertised. This means that content broadcasted must be suited to get people in the buying mood. It must be fairly light-hearted with a relatively pacifying effect so as to not encourage critical attitudes, at least not towards the wrong people. The third filter is sourcing. Where do the mass media get their information from? They need to have a steady flow of news to report each day, and they can't afford to have all of their journalists everywhere at once. The most economically efficient thing to do is to concentrate resources in areas where the most relevant stories are most likely to emerge, around centres of power and influence in the society as a whole, such as the White House, 10 Downing Street, and so on. In societies where the powerful can merely get the public to do their bidding through overt violence, public opinion isn't really relevant. You have to do as we say, and it doesn't really matter what you think about it because we've got the guns. On the other hand, in more liberal societies, the powerful get the public to do their bidding by shaping and influencing popular perceptions and ideas, so public opinion is crucial. As such, powerful institutions have to try to manage the spread of information between themselves and the public. The euphemistic term for this is public relations, although they used to just call it propaganda, quite explicitly. This leads to the development of a mutually beneficial relationship between centres of power and the mass media. The media swarm around centres of power like flies to shit because it's the most economically efficient thing to do, and the centres of power give out self-supporting information because, of course, they aren't going to give out information that subverts their own authority. Reporters tacitly accept the truth value of the information given to them without much critical thought because their media outlet depends on the legitimate authority of centres of power in the society. The fourth mechanism by which information in the mass media is systematically filtered is Flack, here meaning negative responses to a media statement or program. Flack can take various forms, sometimes being organised centrally or merely consisting of the independent actions of individuals. Viewership and ratings may decrease for media institutions undergoing Flack, causing advertisers to withdraw their support, and as such, Flack can be very costly. Corporate or state-funded institutions devoted to what's called objectivity and media criticism are not the honest scientific organisations they claim to be. They're not committed to the pursuit of truth, but rather they serve as a disciplinary mechanism for correcting and punishing those who deviate from the propaganda line by generating Flack. One example of this is the idea of liberal bias. Some left-wing opinions are tolerable, but only up to a certain point. If you actually challenge the authority of corporations or even the state, then that's liberal bias, and you're wrong. The fifth filter is fear ideology. Any attempt to challenge the authority of the institutions that the mass media protect must be met with not only Flack, but incessant fear-mongering, not only against those who attempt to broadcast dissident views within the media, but against anyone who might threaten the profit interests of economic elites. The ideology of anti-communism originally played this role in the US media. If you're not with us, then you're a communist. This helps to keep left and labour organisations constantly on the defensive. Nowadays, this has been more or less replaced with the war on terror.
Either you're with us, either you love freedom and with nations which embrace freedom, or you're with the enemy.
Together, these five filters, ownership, funding, sourcing, Flack, and fear, work in such a way that manufactures public opinion in accordance with the needs of political and economic elites, without the need for any overt coercion. Again, I should stress that this propaganda model is not a conspiracy theory. It is merely a structural analysis of the mass media, and how the political and economic interests of the institutions exert a significant influence over what material is appropriate for broadcasting. So in essence, the media are large private corporations which make a profit by selling relatively privileged audiences to advertisers, disseminating information supportive of centres of power and doing so in an advertiser-friendly way. If they deviate from the propaganda line, they'll get scolded by the Flack machines, and on a general level, ideologies of fear are used as a mechanism of social control. Provided that all of the institutions involved don't actively try to undermine their own interests, which is extremely unlikely, this is how the mass media work. So what does this mean for democracy? Well, it's pretty obvious. The means by which information is disseminated to the voting public in a capitalist system presents a fundamental barrier to popular democracy. That is to say, if the market forces work and the institutions of the mass media successfully carry out their economic functions, popular control over the political system will be marginalized as much as possible, because the public mind is literally a commodity for economic elites to use and abuse as they wish. The more effectively the system does its job, the more conformist, mindlessly consumerist, ill-informed, gullible, passive, and unquestioningly obedient towards centres of power the public will be, rendering their chances of democratic control over the state extremely unlikely, militant action even more so, given that ultimately they will be acting upon information which presupposes that the authority of corporations in the state is legitimate, and that the public ought not to do anything to disrupt that. The prospect of political action by and for the working class becomes marginalised even further when we consider the relationship between centres of economic and political power outlined in Part 1, and how competition between groups of major investors drives the political system. The public aren't just too poor to control the state, but they are given a general propaganda line that says it's bad for them to even attempt to act in their own interests, politically or otherwise. The wealthy classes exercise control over the state, and the media, being run in the interests of the same people, will give the public a supportive view of the elections and the politicians and everything else, painting the arrangement in a fundamentally positive light. So what do we do about this? Well, one perspective, of course, is to blame the public. Why don't the public just go against the grain and do their research? It's just because people are lazy, blah blah blah. This perspective isn't going to bring about social change. Rather than being angry with the public for not pushing against the grain and trying desperately hard to squeeze whatever democracy is possible out of the system, we should be angry at the powerful for setting the grain against democracy in the first place. Not only that, but these institutions, through the systematic perpetuation of economic inequality, the continual accumulation of coercive state power, and the rapid destruction of the natural environment, present a very real threat to decent human survival. Our technological capacities continue to increase every day, and yet our economic system fails conclusively to meet human needs, flooding elites with luxuries and leaving the vast majority of people in misery and destitution. All of these are logical consequences of a state of affairs in which the general population are subordinated to a political and economic elite. Now, there's no debate and discussion over these crucially important issues, besides the spurious notion that we can solve them by electing some other representative of the capitalist class to tinker around the edges and implement cosmetic changes. It's rubbish. If we're seriously interested in our own survival, we have a duty to work towards the creation of a different kind of social order. Of course, any attempt to do so must immediately trigger the typical alarm bells. Those seeking structural changes must be labelled misguided, idealistic, utopian, naive, and so on, whereas it is considered pragmatic and realistic to suggest that we can sustain the existing social order and keep going along with business as usual indefinitely, in spite of the observable tendencies of the system to destroy democracy and systematically annihilate human and animal life at an accelerating rate. Now, there are feasible alternatives: democratic control over workplaces and communities, federal arrangements, horizontal organisation, participatory democracy, self-management, decentralised planning, and so on. Now, ideologically, these have to be kept off the agenda and made to sound insane, but there's nothing in our genetics that renders us incapable of doing these things, and there are libertarian socialist organisations that you can join in your local area that are seeking to explore and create these possible alternatives. And it's very easy to turn your nose up at these things and say, oh, I don't think it's going to work. But if we don't want to face the logical consequences of a social cancer imposed on the population for the benefit of a few, then we must strive to create a freer and more just society. A society where people do not have to be forced into subservience. A society not based on doing things to people, but a society based on working with people. A society where the creative, moral, and intellectual faculties of all people will finally be allowed to unfold. That is anarchism. That is the possible world of the future. It might not be perfect, but it's certainly better than plutocracy.